Welcome back to episode 2 of Sir Alison's History of Europe. Number 18, Chapter 1. The barbarians who overthrew the Roman Empire brought with them, from their deserts, the freedom and energy of savage life. Amidst the expiring embers of civilized institutions, they spread the flames of barbarian independence. On the decayed stock of urban liberty, they engrafted the vigorous shoots of pastoral freedom. From their exploits, the thrones, the monarchs, and the nobles of Europe have taken their rise. In their customs is to be found the source of the laws and institutions of modern times. In their settlements, the origins of the peculiar character by which the different European nations are distinguished. Their conquests were not, in the end, a mere change of government, nor the substitution of one race of monarchs for another. They were a total subversion of the property, customs, and institutions of the vanquished people. Their cities were destroyed, their temples ruined, their movables plundered, their estates confiscated. Footnote. So far was this universal system of disinheriting carried after the Norman conquest, that by a general enactment, inserted in the Domesday Book, all alienations by Saxons subsequent to the conquest of William, and all titles to estates not derived from him and registered in his books, were declared null. The daughters of the greatest among the conquered were compelled to receive husbands from the leaders of their enemies, while those of the inferior classes were exposed to the grossest insults, and driven in despair to the protection of convents. And the youth of the other sex, born to splendid possessions, were sold as slaves, or compelled to labour as serfs on the land which their fathers held as proprietors. To such extremes of distress were the inhabitants of the vanquished states sometimes reduced, that they voluntarily submitted to the bondage, as the price of life, and sought in slavery the only protection which could be obtained from the violence by which they were surrounded. It was not, however, at once, or by any sudden act of violence, that this complete transfer of property from the vanquished to the victors took place. The settlements of the northern nations, in the provinces of the Roman Empire, did not resemble the conquests either of the ancient legions or of the modern armies of Europe, but were rather akin, though more violent, to the gradual inroad which the Irish poor have effected into the provinces of Western Britain in the present times. Wave after wave succeeded before the whole country was occupied. One province was overrun for a whole generation before another was invaded, and a more equitable division of goods between the natives and the conquerors at first took place than could have been expected where the power was at the disposal of such rude barbarians. Sometimes a half, sometimes a third of the vanquished lands was left in the hands of the old proprietors, and although the portion was abridged by each successive inroad of conquerors, yet it was several centuries before the transfer was completely effected, and some remnants of the ancient free or allodial tenure have in all the European monarchies survived the whole changes of the Middle Ages. Gradually, however, the work of spoliation was extended. The depressed condition and timid character of the native inhabitants rendered them incapable of resisting the inroads of their fierce neighbours. Numbers surrendered their properties in exchange for the benefits of feudal protection. The daughters of the vanquished, if entitled to lands, nearly all chose their husbands from the sons of the conquerors, or were compelled to do so by the power of the sovereign. At length the change was generally effected, and the land almost everywhere passed from the Romans to the northern proprietors. Before the 10th century, the transference was complete. The lamentable state of weakness and decay into which the Roman Empire had fallen in the latter ages of its existence, in consequence of the universality of slavery in all its provinces, rendered the people totally incapable of arresting this general spoliation. They submitted, almost without resistance, to every invader, and could hardly be induced to take up arms, even by the most incessant foreign and domestic aggressions. Hence arose a total separation of the higher and lower orders, and entire change in the habits, occupation, and character of the different ranks of society. From the free conquerors of the Roman provinces have sprung the noble and privileged classes of modern Europe. From their enslaved subjects, the numerous and degraded ranks of peasants and labourers. The equality and energy of pastoral life stamped a character of pride and independence on the descendants of the conquerors, which in many countries is yet unabated. The misery and degradation of the vanquished riveted chains about their necks, which were hardly loosed for 1,000 years. In this original separation of the different ranks of society, consequent upon the eruption of the Franks into Gaul, is to be found the remote causes of the evils which induced the French Revolution. But many ages were destined to elapse before the conflicting interests thus came into collision, and it was by the gradual agency of several concurring causes that the energy was restored to the mass of the people, which had been lost amidst the tranquillity of Roman servitude and the violence of feudal oppression. When the lands of the vanquished people were at length generally divided, and the military followers of the victorious invaders had completely overspread the conquered territory, the nobles despised their subjects too much to court their assistance in periods of danger. The mode of warfare then universally practised rendered the baron independent of aid from his inferiors. Literally speaking, he held his possession of God and his sword. Battles were decided by gendarmerie alone, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing that, which with little aid from the foot soldiers. The steel-clad knights rode through the unprotected infantry as they would have done through thickets of broom. It was their brother knights alone who either attracted their notice or were deemed worthy of their hostility. Shut up in castles and surrounded by their own military retainers, they neither required the aid nor felt the sufferings of their bondsmen. The ravages of the Normans, the cruelty of the Huns, excited but little compassion, while it was wreaked only on the slaves of the country. And the baron, secure within his walls, beheld with indifference his villages in flames, and the long files of weeping creatures who were carried off from beneath his ramparts by the desolating invaders. During these long ages of feudal anarchy, the lower orders neither improved in courage nor rose in importance. The lapse of time served only to increase their degradation, by extinguishing the remembrance of better times. But the conquests of the northern nations led to one important consequence: the establishment of representative governments in the provinces of the empire. The liberty of antiquity, cradled in single towns, was confined to the citizens who were present on the spot and could take an active part in the public deliberations. And though the Romans, with unexampled wisdom, extended the general rights of citizenship to the conquered provinces, yet the idea of admitting them to a share of the representation never occurred to their minds, and the more important privileges of a citizen could only be exercised by actually repairing to the metropolis. The unavoidable consequence of this was that the populace of the capital, in all the free states of antiquity, exercised the principal powers of government. From their passions the public measures took their rise, and by their tumults revolutions in the state were effected. The immediate cause of the overthrow of the liberties of Rome was the admission of all the citizens of Italy to the privileges of Roman citizens, coupled with the absence of any provision for their representation, and the consequent introduction of the armed force of the provinces to decide in the streets of Rome, under the banners of the leading generals of the Republic, the constantly recurring contest for political supremacy. Hence the violence, the anarchy, and the inconstancy by which their history was so often distinguished, and which, though concealed amidst the blaze of ancient eloquence, the searching eye of modern history has so fully brought to light. The northern nations, on the other hand, who established themselves on the ruins of the Roman Empire, were actuated by different feelings, and influenced by opposite habits. The liberty which they brought with them was from their woods, or which had sprung up amidst the solitude of the desert, which knew no locality, and was confined to no district. It was the liberty of the steppe, not of the forum. Their civilization was that of the tribe, not of the city. The conqueror had been originally free, and that freedom was equally preserved and valued in the cultivated plain as it was in the desert wilds. Slavery indeed was general, but it was the conquered people who were so prostrated, and the whole dominant race were equally haughty towards their superiors, and tyrannical to their inferiors. When the military followers of a victorious chief were settled in a province they had subdued, they still regarded their leader with somewhat of their original independence. He was distinguished from them only by the preeminence of his rank in actual war, and the magnitude of his share of the vanquished lands. The sea kings who so long desolated the maritime provinces of France and England, and the Anglo-Saxons who laid the foundation of the English Empire, possessed hardly any authority over their followers, except during the period of actual service. The Franks, who under Clovis established the French monarchy, acknowledged but a nominal allegiance to their chief. Elevated on the shields of their followers, the leaders owed their diligence to the voluntary choice of their fellow warriors. And even in moments of triumph, the meanest soldiers were not afraid of reminding them of the tenure by which they held their power. It was the settlement of brave and energetic nations in rich and highly cultivated provinces which led to the diffusion of the victors over the conquered districts, and the establishment of an independent aristocracy amidst the decaying wealth of ancient servitude. Had the country been less richly cultivated, the followers of the northern invaders would have been debased amidst the seduction of cities, or returned, after a predatory incursion, to the solitudes which protected them from pursuits. It was the discovery of opulent and fertile districts, tenanted by a skilful but unwarlike people, which encouraged the rural settlement of the conquerors, which rendered the protection of cities unnecessary, and provided a counterpoise to their allurements. By establishing the invaders in a permanent manner in the country, it long preserved their manners from corruption, and rendered the servitude of the Roman Empire one remote cause of the liberty of modern Europe. On the first settlement of the victorious nations, the popular assemblies of the soldiers were an actual convocation of the military array of the kingdom. William the Conqueror summoned his whole military followers to assemble at Winchester. 60,000 men obeyed the mandate, the poorest of whom held property adequate to the maintenance of a horseman and his attendants. The meetings of the Champ de Mai were less a deputation from the followers of Clovis than an actual congregation of their numbers in one vast assembly. But in the process of time, the burden of travelling from a distance was severely felt, and the prevalence of sedentary habits rendered the landed proprietors unwilling to undertake the risk or expense of personal attendance on the great council of the states. Hence the introduction of parliaments, or representative legislatures, the greatest addition to the cause of liberty which modern times has afforded, which combine the energy of democratic with the caution of aristocratic rule, which temper the turbulence and allay the fervour of cities by the slowness and tenacity of country life, and which, where the balance is duly preserved in the composition of the assembly, provide, in the variety of its interests and habits, a long-enduring check upon the violence or injustice of a part of its members. It is doubtful, however, whether these causes, powerful as they are, would have led to the introduction of that great and hitherto unknown change in government which the representative system introduced, had not a model existed for imitation, in which, for a series of ages, the system had been fully established. The councils of the Church had, so early as the 6th century, introduced all over Christendom the most perfect system of representation. Delegates from the most remote dioceses in Europe and Asia had in them assembled to deliberate on the concerns of the faithful, and every Christian priest, however humble his station, had some share in the formation of those great assemblies, by which the general affairs of the Church were to be regulated. The formation of parliaments, under the representative system, took place in all the European states in the 13th and 14th centuries. The industry of antiquaries may carry the Wittengemot, or actual assembly of leading men, a few generations further back, but 6 centuries before the earliest period assigned for such convocations, the Council of Nice, or Nika, I don't know how to pronounce it, and Antioch had established perfect models of a universal system of representation, embracing a wider sphere than the whole extent of the Roman Empire. There can be no doubt that it was this example, so generally known, and of such powerful authority, which determined the imitation of the other members of the community, where they had any common concerns which required deliberation. And thus, to the other blessings which civilization owes to Christianity, are to be added those inestimable advantages which have flowed from the establishment of the representative system. In every part of Europe, accordingly, where the northern conquerors established themselves, the rudiments of a representative government gradually appeared. In all, the barons settled in the country, and the legislative authority was vested in assemblies of persons elected by them, who, under the name of wittenagemots, parliaments, states general, or cortes, were brought together at stated periods to deliberate on the public concerns. So naturally did this institution spring from the habits and situations of the military settlers, and so little did its first founders anticipate the important consequences which have flowed from its adoption, that the right of sending representations to Parliament was generally considered not as a privilege, but as a burden, and that share in the legislature, which is now so much the object of contention and desire, was originally viewed as an oppressive duty, for which those who exercised it were entitled to indemnification from their more fortunate brethren. The barons, however, were long animated by a strong feeling of independence, and in every part of Europe, at their first establishment, diffused the principle of resistance to arbitrary authority. Accordingly, in Spain, France, Germany, and Flanders, we find them manfully resisting the encroachments of the sovereign, and in all these countries, the same privileges of not being taxed without their consent, and of concurring in the acts of legislature early established. Many causes, doubtless, have conspired to bring about this remarkable and peculiar attachment of the feudal barons to the principle of freedom and the assertion of independence, at least so far as they themselves and their own class in society were concerned. But nothing, perhaps, contributed so powerfully to it as the right of hereditary succession and the establishment of the rights of primogeniture, which, from causes it is impossible now to trace, early became the universal in all the Gothic nations which settled in the European portion of the Roman Empire. It was this which constituted the great distinction between the structure of society in the European and Asiatic continents, in the latter of which, although the northern conquerors settled, they never established the feudal institutions, nor engrafted hereditary succession on the original despotic governments of the Eastern world. Rotation of office, appointment for life, and the entire dependence of every functionary on the sovereign, both for his nomination and his continuance in power, constitute the fundamental basis of Asiatic governments and of despotism, whether regal or democratic, all over the world. The first step in the growth of freedom in all but single cities or mountain cantons is to give the subordinate holder of power a durable interest in his government and strengthen his independence by a lasting connection between himself and the cultivators of the soil. Such an important sentence, I'm going to read it again. The first step in the growth of freedom in all but single cities or mountain cantons is to give the subordinate holder of government a durable interest in his government and strengthen his independence by lasting connections between himself and the cultivators of the soil. Such a change produces the same effect on the character, both of the landholder and his dependents, as the converting of the tenant at will into a copyholder or long leaseholder does on the dispositions of a tenantry. In no rank of life will men make efforts for independence in any situation which they may lose at a moment's notice. The next sentence has a footnote halfway through it, and so I'll read the footnote first. Because it's about America, it says, footnote, America is no exception. On the contrary, it affords the strongest confirmation of these remarks. The sovereign is there the multitude, and there is no restraint on either its injustices or its excesses, as lynch law and the repudiating the state's debts have amply demonstrated. Without primogeniture, to introduce a counterpoise to the power of numbers, it will never attain real freedom. And the sentence is, as durability of power in one class of society and the hereditary transmission of land are thus the only lasting foundation for a restraint on the sovereign power in a rural community, it would appear surprising that these institutions should be so much the object of jealousy in all opulent or commercial communities, did we not recollect that human corruption makes all establishments liable to abuse, and that the very stability which renders the landed aristocracy in great degrees independent of the sovereign gives them facilities, too often taken advantage of, for oppressing the people. In all the states, accordingly, in which it was established, the feudal system was subject to the same fatal defect, that it made no provision for the interests or welfare of the inferior classes of society. Like all other institutions in which this want existed, it contained within itself the principles of its own decay. The conquerors of the Roman Empire deemed the inhabitants of the provinces in which they settled wholly unworthy of notice, and even in Magna Carta, while the privileges of the barons and the freemen were anxiously provided for, no stipulation of any importance was made for the extensive class of husbandmen and slaves, embracing at least 9/10 of the community. The decline in virtue of the barbarous settlers was in most instances extremely rapid, and the succeeding wave of invaders generally found the first set sunk in sloth or destroyed by luxury. In the miserable and degraded barons who deserted Roderick in his contests with the Moorish invaders of Spain, we can hardly discern a trace of resemblance to the impetuous warriors who under Adolf, brother to Alaric, the terrible destroyer of Rome, had crossed the Pyrenees in 412, and penetrated into that secluded province of the Roman Empire, and the Moorish conquerors were in a few centuries reduced to the same degraded state from the operation of the same causes. Even the genius and triumphs of Charlemagne were unequal to the Herculean task of regenerating the mixture of barbarism and effeminacy of which he formed the head, and humanity never appeared in a more pusillanimous or impotent form than among the Rois Faintons, the unworthy successors of Charles Martel. Even the genius and triumphs of Charlemagne were unequal to the Herculean task of regenerating the mixture of barbarism and effeminacy of which he formed the head, and humanity never appeared in a more pusillanimous or impotent form than among the Rois Faintons, the unworthy successors of Charles Martel, and of the barons who died for the liberty of Christendom on the field of Tours. All the efforts of that great monarch for the improvement of his people were thwarted by the limited number of real citizens who existed among them. A few 100,000 freemen were there to be found scattered among many millions of slaves. And, in his own lifetime, he had the misfortune of beholding the progress of corruption, even among the troops whom he had led to victory. The same cause blasted all the beneficent efforts of Alfred for the protection and improvement of his country, and exposed the English nation, for so long a period, to desolation and ruin from a small body of northern invaders. A very simple cause may be assigned for this early corruption and rapid degeneracy of rude conquerors who have settled in the abodes of ancient opulence. They attain riches before they have learned how to use them. Luxury breaks in upon them, while yet accessible only to the gratifications of sense. Experience has now abundantly proved that to learn the art of using wealth without abusing it requires at least as long an apprenticeship in nations as that of enjoying freedom without running into licentiousness, and that the rapid acquisition of either never fails to prove fatal to the people who obtain it. It is the sudden exposure to irresistible temptation which, in both cases, is the cause of ruin. The same thing may every day be observed in private life. The common sayings that no man was ever enriched in the end by obtaining £20,000 prize in the lottery, that the sons of rich parvenus are much more inclined to extravagance than those of the old families, and that it requires 3 generations to make a gentleman, prove how generally mankind have observed the operations of this principle on the fortunes of individuals or particular families. When an Iroquois sits down beside a cask of spirits, he often inserts a straw into a hole which he has bored in the wood, and sucks up the intoxicating draught till he drops down dead on the spot. But a gentleman who has the command of a cellar amply stored with champagne is in no danger of perishing by a similar indulgence. The reason is that he has acquired other tastes, and is familiar with other enjoyments, which are inconsistent with, or prove a counterpoise to, the first seductions of sense. But these more refined tastes and inclinations are of very slow growth. They spring up only in the later stages of society. Many generations must descend to their graves before they spread generally, either in nations or in any of the classes of which they are composed. This is the true cause of the excessive proneness to the use of ardent spirits, which is invariably observed to accompany high wages, arising from manufacturing prosperity in northern climes of half-civilized states, and which has hitherto defied all the efforts of coercion and philanthropy for its restraint, while the higher classes in the same countries and professions have at length, though only by very slow degrees, extricated itself from its influence. Now here he's got down the bottom with a lot of numbers, a very fascinating footnote, and I'll try to skip over too many of the details to make it brief because it's rather funny as well. And it goes like this: the number of gallons of spirits consumed in 1838 and the proportion of head were, in England, out of a population of 8 million, the number of gallons consumed in England was about 8 million in a population of 13 million, leaving a ratio of, in fact, I'll just read the ratios because it'll take too damn long. In England, the average person consumed 0.5 of a gallon per year. In Ireland, the average person consumed 1.32 gallons. In Scotland, it was 2.46, and in Australia, 5.02. And then it goes on to say, in Sweden, where artificial wants are few and stills many, any man, upon paying a trifling license, may purchase from government the right of distilling spirits to any amount. There are 150,000 stills and spirits consumed to the enormous amount of 30 million gallons among 3 million inhabitants, or 10 gallons a head, which means they're drinking 20 times more than the English at the time. As a natural and too probable consequence, the proportion of crime to the whole population, even in its simple agricultural population, equals that of the most corrupt cities of Great Britain, and is fully triple that of the average of the British population. In the rural districts of Sweden, the committals for serious crime are to the population as 1 in 460. In the towns, 1 in 78. For England, they were, in 1841, 1 in 573 persons. For Scotland, 1 in 738. Isn't that funny? The Scots drink almost 5 times more, and yet they're less prone to crime. Good on the Scots. These facts at once explain the rapid corruption of the northern conquerors, when transplanted into the midst and passions and gratifications of civilized life. If we would ascertain the secret springs of the greatest revolutions which have ever occurred amongst mankind, we've only to look around us at the causes which elevate particular individuals and families, and consign others to infamy and ruin. The spring of all human changes is to be found in the human heart, and it is to be read as well in a village as in an empire. Anyway, back to the work. Sensual gratification instantly become the object of universal pursuit. The winepress and the harem present attractions to which no one, how illiterate soever, is insensible, and the race of northern conquerors melts away as rapidly amidst the wines and women of the south as the Iroquois perishes beside the spirit cask, or the Scotch or Swedish manufacturer amidst the riot of the spirit cellar. The private wars of the nobles with each other was the first circumstance which renewed the courage and revived the energy of the feudal barons. The inconsiderate historians of modern times have stigmatized these domestic contests as things of unmixed evil, merely because they produced extensive bloodshed and suffering. But the more reflecting observer, who has traced the workings of corruption, whether on the individual or the national heart, will arrive at a different conclusion. He will recollect the necessity of suffering to individual reformation. He will reflect on the virtues which spring out of disaster. Regarding this world not as a scene of enjoyment so much as the school of improvement, he will not lightly estimate those circumstances, apparently ruinous, which extricate the human mind from the meshes of sensual gratification, which draw forth the manly virtues by the force of suffering, and elevate the character even when they embitter the life. It is to this cause, joined to the fortification of the castles, and to the constant use of arms by the retainers of the landowners, that the restoration of the military courage of France is to be ascribed. The Spanish barons were trained in courage in the stern school of necessity, and regained in the mountains of Galicia the valour which their conquerors were losing amidst the luxuries of Cordova. The English military spirit, which had decayed from the same causes, was restored by the private wars of the nobles during the reign of Stephen. And through all the havoc and ruin of the country, that courage was elicited, which was destined to lay the foundation of British liberty in a happier age. That is a most extraordinary claim. I don't know if you buy it. Sorry, I have to pause. I'm a bit overwhelmed. As a matter of fact, on that bombshell that the civil wars in under Stephen were a good thing, actually, which he goes on to explicate more. I've read far ahead. It does end up being, a good point, but I'll leave you with that to chew on. Thank you very much for listening to episode 2. I hope I didn't read too quick, and I hope the mic quality is a bit better. We'll see how it went. And thank you very much for listening to episode 2. The next episode is a really good one. The book really just keeps getting better from here on, actually. I'm really impressed. I've been swept away by it, and I've read about 10 times as much as I've read aloud, so much more to come. Thank you for listening. Have a good one. Bye.